Hello everyone, in this section, we'll introduce Data Service. Data Service supports data sharing, allowing processed and integrated data to be packaged and published as standardized APIs for external systems to call, thus achieving data value output and openly sharing. If we want to publish a data table in a MySQL database as an API so that other systems can use this API for data retrieval, then we can use our Data Service function. Setting the blacklist and whitelist can ensure that the published API is safer when it is called by external systems. The IP addresses or IP ranges specified in the blacklist and whitelist restrict access to API. About publishing API, the first step is to configure the API information, including the name, request method, and path of the API. The second step is to set the release content and parameter. We need to select the data source to be published and data connection. Enter the SQL statement and configure the request parameters. The next step is to conduct a previewing test, where we can test an API call. For example, we can enter the value of the request parameter to see if the API can be successfully called. Finally, we need to bring the API online. Our API is presented in the API list, which is also convenient for us to carry out subsequent management. The fifth step is to set up and bind the application, which means that we use the application to manage the published API in batches. After an API is bound to the corresponding application, the API in the same application has the same authentication method and the same route path for access. For example, now there is an app called Score. If Task 1 is bound to the app, then when you use the link of this API to retrieve the data from the API, it will have the ID of the app. Each application has a corresponding ID and authentication information, and the application and the API are many-to-many. The same API can exist in multiple applications, and the same application can have multiple API. After the API has been successfully published, we can use it. For example, we can export the API document in the application to obtain API links, authentication methods, request methods, and other information, and we can also provide it to the caller for their reference. The request parameters and response parameters here are defined, and they will be explained in detail when we do practical operations for you later. After the API is published, we can manage and monitor API tasks, view the running status, and API calls. Next, I will demonstrate the relevant operations to help you have a preliminary understanding of our data service functions. Let's say we want to publish a table called exam in a MySQL database as an API and call the API data in other systems, then we can use Data Service. After entering the Find Data Link platform, select the Data Service. On this page is a list of APIs, where we created the API to be published. It is managed in the form of folders. For example, we can create a new folder and then change its name, assuming the folder name is 1.0. Then let's go to the bottom of the folder and create an API and start configuring the API information. We named the API grade. At the same time, we can also add some ways to describe and publish a request to the API. Regarding the request method, we can choose GET or POST. Let's assume that here we select POST, and then we choose JSON for the body format of the request. Regarding the path, we can enter the link to the API we publish. Here I will fill in the order. The application ID on the page is the ID of the application to which we want to bind the API later. There is a timeout setting on the page. We can create an API for the applications we already have. At the moment, we haven't created an app yet, so we won't bind it to it. Click Next, and on this page, we can configure the content and parameters of the release. For data sources, we choose MySQL. Of course, the data source needs to be added at the data connection of the management system to help us connect the database, where the data we need to publish as an API is located to Find Data Link. Here we select MySQL. After creating a MySQL data connection, we enter the database name, host, port, username, password, and other related information. Then we can click on Test Connection and save the data connection. Back to the Data Service page, we can select the database containing the processed data that needs to be published to Find Data Link. For configuration methods, you can select either SQL or table selection. We choose the exam table and expect to publish the exam table as an API, and we use SQL statements to pass multiple values with one parameter. If we want us to enter the API request parameter score and we enter a parameter 80, then it can return the data we need directly after it passes in the data. The page will then automatically appear with a configuration of the requested parameters. Since we set a score parameter, the page displays the parameter name as score. For the parameter type, we can choose a string value or a boolean, and then we can also check whether the parameter value is required. Click on the setting of the return value. We make the return value greater than 80. Click OK. The page will automatically generate the configuration of the parameter values. However, if we don't set the parameter values, there will be problems with the exported API file after setting up the app. Regarding this part, I recommend that you configure the relevant parameters. Click Next and we can see what the test calling looks like. Click Test Calling, and the page information shows that the default name value is score and the default parameter value is 80. About paging on a page, where page number represents the number of pages and page size indicates the number of data entries per page. When the amount of data in the API is particularly large, the application cannot read all the data, so we fetch the data by page. In this example, we only take the first 10 pieces of data on the first page for testing. The page displays the returned data. Then we click on API generation and go back to the API list page, where we can see the API we just created. By default, the API is offline, which means that we can't call the API directly. At this time, we need to click Online in the upper right corner of the page, and we can configure the application after completion. Click on the application list, and we find that the apps are also managed through folders. Let's just add a new app and change its name to Grade. Regarding the authentication method of the application, the app code is a long-term valid token. If we select it, we need to specify the value of the app code in the request header. If we choose to sign the digest, this is also a way of authentication. Then we bind the API we just created and click Save. Through the above operations, we have implemented the binding of the Grade application to the Grade API. After that, when the Grade API is accessed, it contains the ID of the Grade application in the path. Once that's done, we're ready to use the published API. Click Export API Documentation. Let's view this API documentation. Here are some basic information: API path, access frequency, authorization validity period, request method is POST, body parameter is score, etc. Here's an example of a request. Finally, we're going to use the API, and I'm going to use Postman for this demo. First, let's create an API and select POST as the request method. Regarding the URL, we can directly copy the path of the app and paste it here. Of course, we can also copy the path of the Grade application at the bottom of the corresponding API in the API list. If we chose AppCode or some other authentication method in the previous operation, then we need to select the authentication method in Auth Now. Let's say here I select the API key and then enter the relevant parameters. Its value is in the application editor. If you select AppCode, we can directly copy and paste. Of course, we didn't have to set it up before, so we don't need to configure it at this time, so we won't demonstrate it here. Since we chose the request method as POST, we chose RAW and JSON formats. Regarding the value of the body, we can open the API documentation we just downloaded and copy-paste the request example. If we want to take data with a score greater than 80, and only 10 pieces of data are taken. When we send the request, we can see that the data is returned successfully. The total amount of data returned is 3, and the return value is success. That's all about data services.